The doctor said I had 6 months to live, but I never told my family. Instead, I spent those months watching them fight over my inheritance, while I secretly rewrote my will to teach them the most expensive lesson about greed they'd ever learn. Dr. Martinez's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, filling the small examination room with the acrid smell of finality. Mrs. Betty Morrison, I'm afraid the test results confirm our worst fears. The cancer has spread extensively throughout your liver and pancreas. With treatment, we might extend your life by a few months, but realistically, you're looking at 6 months, perhaps less. I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing the hospital gown that made me feel vulnerable and small, and felt something unexpected wash over me. Not fear, not despair, but a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. 6 months. 180 days to finally understand who my family really was when they thought I wasn't watching. "Doctor, what are my treatment options?" I asked, though I was already forming a plan that had nothing to do with chemotherapy or radiation. "We could try an aggressive course of treatment, but given your age and the advanced stage of the disease, it would likely just make your remaining time more difficult without significantly extending your life." 74 years old. I had lived 3/4 of a century, raised 4 children, buried a husband I loved deeply, and accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably for whatever time I had left. But in those 6 months, I was going to discover something more valuable than money: the truth about the people who claimed to love me. "Doctor, I need to ask you something very important. If I choose not to pursue treatment, how will my decline be visible to others?" Dr. Martinez looked puzzled by the question. "Mrs. Morrison, are you asking about the physical progression of the disease?" "I'm asking whether my family will be able to tell that I'm dying just by looking at me." "In the early stages, probably not. You might experience some fatigue, occasional discomfort, but nothing that would be immediately obvious to casual observers. The more dramatic symptoms typically appear in the final weeks." Perfect. I had months to conduct the most important experiment of my life, and my subjects wouldn't even know they were being studied. But what I didn't tell Dr. Martinez was that I'd been planning for this moment for years. Ever since my husband Harold died 5 years earlier, I'd been watching my children with growing concern. Not concern for their well-being, but concern about their character. Every family gathering had become a subtle negotiation about my future, my assets, my wishes for how my estate should be handled. They spoke about my death with the casual efficiency of people planning a vacation, discussing inheritance tax strategies and property valuations with more enthusiasm than they ever showed for my actual company. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand this is overwhelming news. Do you have family members you'd like me to speak with? Sometimes it helps to have support during this process." "No, doctor. I'd prefer to keep this information private for now. I need time to process this myself before involving others." "Of course, but please don't isolate yourself during this difficult time. Family support can be crucial for maintaining quality of life." If only he knew that my family's idea of support involved calculating the value of my jewelry and discussing whether my house should be sold or turned into a rental property. I left the doctor's office that afternoon with a terminal diagnosis, and for the first time in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with managing my decline and everything to do with managing my legacy. But not the kind of legacy my children were expecting. That evening, I sat in my study surrounded by legal documents, financial statements, and family photos that told the story of decades spent building something I was no longer sure was worth preserving. My current will divided my estate equally among my 4 children: Robert, Patricia, David, and Susan. Standard, fair, unimaginative. But fairness, I was beginning to realize, wasn't the same thing as justice. And justice required understanding who truly deserved the fruits of a lifetime's worth of work and sacrifice. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making lists. Not lists of assets or beneficiaries, but lists of behaviors. Who called just to check on my well-being versus who called to discuss my future plans. Who visited because they enjoyed my company versus who visited because they wanted to stay informed about my situation. Who treated me like a person versus who treated me like an estate waiting to be distributed. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than my cancer diagnosis. Over the past 5 years, every interaction with my children had been tinged with financial calculation. Robert, my eldest, had started conversations about tax-efficient giving and suggested that I might want to gift large sums to my children while I was still alive to avoid estate taxes. Patricia had begun making comments about how much work it was to maintain my large house and how I might be happier in a smaller place, freeing up equity for better investments. David had offered to help manage my portfolio with increasing frequency, pointing out that someone my age shouldn't be taking unnecessary risks with money that would eventually benefit the family anyway. Only Susan seemed genuinely interested in spending time with me for its own sake, but even she had started making comments about protecting the family legacy and ensuring that my assets were properly managed for future generations. None of them knew that I'd been keeping detailed notes about these conversations for months, documenting a pattern of behavior that revealed more about their priorities than any honest conversation ever could. Now I had 6 months to conduct the ultimate test. 6 months to see how they behaved when they thought I was healthy and likely to live for years, versus how they might behave if they knew I was dying. 6 months to observe their true character when the stakes were at their highest. But most importantly, I had 6 months to ensure that my legacy would teach them something they apparently hadn't learned in their decades as my children. That love and money are not the same thing, and greed is the most expensive inheritance anyone can leave their family. The experiment was about to begin. I decided to approach my final months like a scientist conducting research, with hypotheses to test and data to collect. My hypothesis was simple. If my children knew I was dying, their behavior toward me would change dramatically, revealing their true motivations for maintaining relationships with their elderly mother. But I needed a control group for my experiment, so I made a decision that would prove more revealing than I could have imagined. I called my lawyer, James Peterson, the next morning. James, I need to schedule an appointment to discuss some changes to my estate planning. Of course, Betty. Are you thinking about updating your will? I'm thinking about testing it. James had been my attorney for 15 years and had learned not to question my unconventional approaches to family matters. When I explained my situation and my plan, his response was characteristically direct. Betty, what you're proposing is unusual. You want to spend your final months observing your family's behavior without telling them you're dying? I want to understand who they really are when they think I'm not paying attention, and I want to ensure that my legacy reflects what I've learned. And you're certain about not pursuing treatment? James, I'm 74 years old. I've lived a full life, and I've seen what aggressive cancer treatment does to people my age. I'd rather spend my remaining time conscious and clear-minded, gathering information that will help me make the most important decisions I'll ever make. Within a week, James had prepared multiple versions of my will, the current version that my family knew about, and several alternatives that reflected different scenarios based on what my research might reveal. We also established a private trust that would allow me to make charitable donations without my family's knowledge, just in case my experiment revealed that my money might do more good outside the family than within it. But the most important element of my plan was establishing a detailed documentation system. I began keeping a daily journal, recording every interaction with my children, every phone call, every visit, every conversation about my health, my finances, or my future. I installed discrete recording devices in my home, with James's help, ensuring that I could document not just what my children said to me, but what they said to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. The first month of my experiment produced results that were both predictable and heartbreaking. When my children believed I was healthy and likely to live for many more years, their interactions with me followed the same pattern I'd observed for years: polite interest in my well-being, combined with persistent curiosity about my financial affairs. But I decided to accelerate the experiment by introducing variables that would test their responses to perceived changes in my situation. I began mentioning minor health concerns in conversations, nothing that suggested terminal illness, just the kind of age-related issues that might make them think about mortality in general terms. I complained about fatigue, mentioned that my doctor wanted to run some tests, expressed concern about managing my finances as I got older. The response was immediate and revealing. Within days of mentioning these minor concerns, all 4 of my children had called or visited, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to assess whether anything had changed that might affect their inheritance prospects. Robert's visit was particularly illuminating. "Mom, you mentioned that Dr. Martinez wanted to run some tests. Is everything okay?" "Oh, just routine screenings, dear. You know how doctors are. They want to test everything when you reach a certain age." "That's good. But Mom, while I'm here, I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding estate planning. Have you given any more thought to making some strategic gifts while you're still healthy? The tax benefits could be significant." The timing was perfect. I wasn't even sick as far as he knew, just getting some routine tests, and his immediate response was to discuss tax-efficient ways to transfer my wealth to him while I was still alive. But what happened next was what convinced me that my experiment was necessary. Patricia's approach was more subtle but equally revealing. Instead of direct discussions about money, she began making comments about my independence and my ability to manage my affairs. "Mom, I've been worried about you living alone in this big house. What if something happened and no one was here to help? Maybe we should start thinking about some safety measures." "What kind of safety measures?" "Well, maybe someone could check on you daily. Or you could consider moving somewhere with more support services available. I know it's hard to think about these things, but we want to make sure you're safe." Safety. The same word that families use when they want to justify taking control of an elderly person's life and assets. Patricia wasn't worried about my physical safety. She was worried about the safety of her inheritance if something happened to me before she could ensure her access to it. David's response to my vague health concerns was to increase his offers to help with my financial management. "Mom, if you're not feeling as strong as you used to, maybe this is a good time to let me take a more active role in managing your investments. You shouldn't have to worry about these things when you're dealing with health issues." Even Susan, who had always been the most genuinely caring of my children, began making subtle inquiries about my wishes for how my affairs should be handled if I became unable to manage them myself. The pattern was unmistakable. The mere suggestion that I might be experiencing health issues triggered immediate concern about inheritance security, rather than concern about my well-being. But the most devastating revelation came when I overheard a conversation between Robert and Patricia. I had invited all 4 children for Sunday dinner, something I'd been doing monthly for years. After dinner, while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, they gathered in the living room for what they thought was a private conversation. "I'm worried about Mom," Robert said. "She seems more tired lately, and all these doctor visits. What if something's seriously wrong?" "Have you asked her directly?" David inquired. "She's not telling us everything, but if she is getting sicker, we need to make sure our interests are protected." Our interests. Not my interests. Not my well-being. Not my comfort during a potentially difficult time. Their interests. Patricia's response was what finally convinced me that my experiment was revealing exactly what I needed to know. "We should probably encourage her to update her power of attorney documents, and maybe suggest that she consider making some larger gifts now, while she's still competent to make those decisions." While she's still competent, they were already planning for my incompetence, calculating how to position themselves to benefit from my decline. That night, I made my first major revision to my will. But what my children didn't know was that their behavior during my health scare had just cost them far more than they could imagine. 3 months into my 6-month timeline, I received news that changed everything about my experiment. Dr. Martinez called with results from my latest tests, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and cautious optimism that I had never heard before. "Mrs. Morrison, I need you to come in immediately. There's been a development in your case that I can't explain over the phone." I sat in his office 2 hours later, surrounded by the same clinical furniture and motivational posters that had witnessed my original death sentence. But this time, the conversation took an entirely different direction. "Betty, your latest scans show something remarkable. The tumors in your liver have shrunk by 60%, and the pancreatic masses are barely detectable. I've never seen anything like this in a case as advanced as yours was." The words didn't immediately register. "What are you saying, doctor?" "I'm saying that whatever was killing you 3 months ago appears to be in complete remission. I can't explain it medically, but you're essentially cancer-free." Cancer-free. The diagnosis that should have filled me with relief and gratitude instead filled me with a strange sense of completion. I had been given 6 months to learn who my family really was, and I had learned exactly what I needed to know. The fact that I now had years instead of months to act on that knowledge was almost secondary to the revelation itself. "Doctor, what are the chances of the cancer returning?" In cases like this, and I have to emphasize that cases like this are extremely rare, long-term remission is possible. You'll need regular monitoring, but there's no reason to believe you won't live for many more years. Many more years. Years that my children had been planning around my absence. Years they had been calculating their inheritance potential. Years they had been positioning themselves to benefit from my death. But what they didn't know was that their behavior during my final months had already determined their actual inheritance. That afternoon, I called James Peterson with news that would require completely revising our legal strategy. James, I need to see you immediately. My diagnosis has changed dramatically. Changed how? I'm not dying anymore, but my family doesn't know that yet. James's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Betty, what exactly are you planning? I'm planning to see how they behave when they think I'm dying versus how they behaved when they thought I was healthy. And then I'm planning to make my final decisions about their inheritance based on what I've learned. You're going to tell them about the original diagnosis? Eventually. But first, I want to see what happens when they think my death is imminent. I want to understand who they become when they believe the inheritance conversation is no longer theoretical. What I proposed next was the most ethically complex experiment I had ever designed, but the results would be worth any moral ambiguity. Over the next 2 weeks, I began subtly changing my behavior to suggest that my health was declining more rapidly than I had previously indicated. I started canceling social engagements, mentioning increased fatigue, and making vague references to difficult conversations with my doctor. The response from my children was immediate and revealing. Suddenly, they were visiting more frequently, calling more often, and showing unprecedented interest in spending quality time with me. But their version of quality time invariably included conversations about my wishes for how my affairs should be handled. Robert's approach became increasingly direct. Mom, I know you don't like talking about this, but if something were to happen to you, we want to make sure we understand your wishes. Have you updated your will recently? Why do you ask, dear? Well, tax laws have changed, and there might be more efficient ways to structure your estate. I'd be happy to review your current documents with an attorney who specializes in these matters. The presumption was breathtaking. He was offering to help me restructure my estate to benefit him, using my perceived declining health as justification for urgency. Patricia's approach was more emotional but equally calculating. Mom, I've been thinking about all the things I want to tell you while I still have the chance. You've been such an important part of our lives, and I want to make sure you know how much we appreciate everything you've done for the family. Everything I'd done for the family. Like accumulating wealth that they were already planning to inherit. But the most revealing conversation came when I overheard David discussing my situation with his wife. I had invited David and his family for dinner, and after the meal I excused myself to rest, citing fatigue. As I lay in my bedroom, I could hear their conversation through the thin walls. How bad do you think it is? David's wife asked. She's not telling us everything, but she's clearly declining faster than she was a few months ago. I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that this could happen quickly. Have you talked to her about the inheritance? Not directly, but I've been encouraging her to think about tax-efficient strategies for transferring assets. If she waits too long, we could lose a significant amount to estate taxes. We could lose a significant amount, as if my money was already theirs, and my continued existence was preventing them from accessing what rightfully belonged to them. That conversation convinced me that my experiment had gathered all the data I needed. My children viewed my potential death not as a loss to be grieved, but as an opportunity to be optimized. But what I decided to do next would teach them that assumptions about inheritance can be far more dangerous than assumptions about death. The following morning, I called James Peterson with instructions that would change my family's future forever. James, I want to make the final revisions to my will. Based on what I've observed over the past several months, I now know exactly how I want my estate to be distributed. And your children? My children have shown me who they really are when they think death is imminent. They've proven that their primary concern isn't my well-being or their relationship with me. It's securing their access to my money. So what do you want to do? I want to give them exactly what they've earned through their behavior. And I want to ensure that the people who truly deserve my legacy are the ones who benefit from it. But what I told James next was something that would surprise even him. James, I also want to establish a foundation that will use my estate to help other elderly people whose families are more interested in their money than their well-being. I want my legacy to teach future generations that love and greed are mutually exclusive. The final version of my will would reflect everything I'd learned during my 6-month experiment with mortality. My children's inheritance would be determined not by what they expected or felt entitled to, but by how they had treated me when they thought I was dying. And soon they would learn that the most expensive lesson of their lives had been taught by a woman they thought was too sick to pay attention to their true character. The experiment was complete, the results were damning, and the consequences would be permanent. 6 months after my original diagnosis, I decided it was time to reveal both my recovery and my discoveries to my family, but I wanted to do it in a way that would demonstrate just how much I had learned about their true priorities during my final months. I invited all 4 children and their spouses to Sunday dinner, the same kind of family gathering where I had overheard so many revealing conversations about my assets and their inheritance expectations. But this time, I had prepared a presentation that would expose everything I'd observed and recorded during my months of pretending to be dying. Children, I have some important news to share with you about my health, I began as we gathered in the living room after dinner. But first, I want to show you something that I've been working on during these past few months. I had prepared a photo album, not of family memories, but of documentation, screenshots of text messages between siblings about my situation, transcripts of phone conversations where they discussed inheritance strategies, time-stamped recordings of their private conversations about my health and their financial concerns. "Mom, what is all this?" Robert asked, flipping through pages of documented evidence of their greed. "This is 6 months of research into who my children really are when they think their mother is dying." The silence that followed was suffocating. Patricia was the first to understand the implications. "Mom, you've been recording us. I've been documenting your behavior during what you believed were my final months, and what I discovered was more disturbing than any cancer diagnosis." I pulled out my laptop and began showing them video clips, conversations they'd had in my house while they thought I was resting, phone calls they'd made from my kitchen while I was supposedly napping, discussions about inheritance tax strategies while I was sitting just one room away. But what shocked them most was the systematic nature of my documentation. "This spreadsheet," I explained, pulling up a detailed chart, "tracks every interaction each of you had with me over the past 6 months. Column A shows conversations that mentioned my well-being. Column B shows conversations that mentioned my financial affairs. Notice anything interesting about the proportions?" David's face had gone pale. "Mom, this isn't, you can't have been." "I can't have been what, David? Paying attention? Taking notes, recording conversations that took place in my own home?" "We thought you were sick," Susan protested. "We were trying to help." "Help with what?" "Exactly. Because according to my documentation, your primary concern wasn't my comfort or care during a terminal illness. Your primary concern was ensuring that my death didn't interfere with your access to my money." I turned to a page in the photo album that contained printed transcripts of their most damaging conversations. "Patricia, would you like to read aloud what you said to Robert on March 15th? About the urgency of getting me to update my power of attorney documents?" Patricia's hands were shaking. "Mom, you're taking these conversations out of context." "Am I? Because I have 6 months of context. 6 months of watching you treat my potential death like a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy." But what I revealed next was what really devastated them. The most interesting part of my research was discovering how your behavior changed based on what you believed about my prognosis. When you thought I was healthy and likely to live for years, you were mildly interested in my financial affairs. But when you suspected I might be seriously ill, you became intensely focused on inheritance strategies and asset protection. I pulled out another document, a timeline showing the correlation between their visits, their expressions of concern, and their discussions about my money. The pattern was undeniable. This graph shows that your interest in spending time with me increased by 300% during the months when you believed I was dying, but your expressions of genuine affection remained constant. What increased was your interest in discussing my wishes for how my affairs should be handled. Robert was studying the documents with the expression of someone who realized they'd been caught in something they couldn't deny. "Mom, we were trying to be responsible. If something happened to you, we wanted to make sure your wishes were honored." "My wishes? Robert, you never once asked me what my actual wishes were. You told me what you thought my wishes should be, based on what would be most financially advantageous for you." Michael, Patricia's husband, tried to defend their behavior. "Betty, you have to understand, estate planning is complex. We were trying to help you avoid unnecessary taxes and complications." "Whose taxes, Michael? Because estate taxes are paid by the estate, not the beneficiaries. You were trying to help yourselves avoid complications, not help me." But the most damning evidence was still to come. I played an audio recording of a conversation between David and Susan that I'd captured 3 weeks earlier, when they thought I was too sick to leave my bedroom. David's voice filled the room. "We need to coordinate our approach. If Mom's condition deteriorates quickly, we don't want to be scrambling to figure out the financial implications." Susan's response. Have you talked to that attorney you mentioned? The one who specializes in emergency estate planning? He said that if we can establish that Mom's cognitive function is declining along with her physical health, we might be able to expedite some asset transfers while she's still legally competent. The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting their discussion of various scenarios for accessing my money quickly, depending on how my decline progressed. When the recording ended, the room was silent, except for the sound of Patricia crying. But I wasn't finished yet. 6 months ago, I received a terminal cancer diagnosis. I was told I had 6 months to live. Instead of telling you immediately, I decided to use those months to understand who you really were when you thought I was dying. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Susan was the first to understand the full implications. You've been dying this whole time? I was dying. But 3 months ago, my cancer went into complete remission. I'm now cancer-free and likely to live for many more years. Why didn't you tell us? Robert demanded. Because I wanted to see who you became when you thought my death was imminent. And what I saw was that you became people who viewed my dying as an opportunity to optimize your inheritance rather than as a tragedy to be grieved. But what I told them next was what finally made them understand the consequences of their behavior. Based on what I've learned during these 6 months, I've made some significant changes to my estate planning. Changes that reflect what you've taught me about your priorities and your character. David's voice was barely a whisper. What kind of changes? The kind that ensure my legacy will reflect the love and respect I received from my family during what I believed were my final months. I handed each of them a copy of my new will, a document that would redistribute my entire estate based on their documented behavior during my dying months. The numbers told the story of their greed in language they would understand perfectly, and the silence that followed told me that my 6-month experiment had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. They had taught me who they really were, and now my will would teach them that greed is the most expensive inheritance anyone can leave their family. The new will I handed to my children that evening was a masterpiece of moral mathematics. Every dollar of inheritance was calculated based on documented evidence of their behavior during my 6 months of pretending to be dying. The spreadsheets didn't lie, and neither did the final accounting. Susan, because you were the only one who consistently asked about my comfort and well-being without immediately transitioning to discussions about my financial affairs, you will inherit 40% of my estate. Susan looked stunned. 40%? But Mom, that's not fair to the others. Actually, it's completely fair. Your siblings will each inherit exactly what their behavior earned them. I turned to Robert, whose face had already begun calculating the implications. Robert, your documented conversations show that you mentioned my money or my assets in 85% of our interactions during my illness. You will inherit 5% of my estate. 5%? His voice cracked with disbelief. Mom, that's completely disproportionate. It's perfectly proportionate to your priorities. You spent 85% of your time with me focused on my money, so your inheritance reflects that proportion. Patricia was reading her copy with growing horror. 10%? Mom, this can't be serious. Your documented behavior shows slightly less financial focus than Robert's, but significantly more manipulation. You attempted to use emotional appeals to pressure me into making financial decisions that would benefit you. Your inheritance reflects both the frequency and the manipulative nature of your behavior. David hadn't spoken yet, but his hands were shaking as he read his portion. 15%. I don't understand how you calculated this. Your behavior was more subtle but equally concerning. You consistently offered to help with my financial management while expressing doubt about my competence. Your inheritance reflects the documented frequency of these offers and the underlying assumption that I was too incapacitated to manage my own affairs. But what shocked them most was learning about the remaining 30% of my estate. The final 30% of my assets will be used to establish the Morrison Foundation for Elder Dignity, which will provide legal assistance to elderly people whose families are more interested in their money than their well-being. The foundation would be run by professionals who understood that love and greed were mutually exclusive, and it would provide exactly the kind of protection I had needed during my 6 months of observing my family's true character. Mom, you can't do this, Robert protested. This will destroy our family. Robert, I didn't destroy our family. I documented its destruction. For 6 months I watched you treat my potential death as a business opportunity rather than a personal tragedy. This will simply formalize as what you've already done." Patricia was crying harder now, but her tears seemed more related to financial loss than emotional recognition. "Mom, we were trying to help. We were scared and didn't know how to handle your illness." "Patricia, I have recordings of you discussing inheritance tax strategies while I was supposedly dying in the next room. You weren't scared about losing me. You were scared about losing access to my money." But what I revealed next was what finally made them understand the full scope of their miscalculation. "I also want you to understand that this will is irrevocable. I've structured my estate in such a way that these distributions cannot be challenged, modified, or contested. The documentation I've gathered over the past 6 months will be made available to any court that questions my competence or my decisions." James Peterson, who had been observing this confrontation from the corner of the room, stepped forward. "I can confirm that Mrs. Morrison's estate planning has been structured with extensive legal protections. The will is ironclad, and the documentation of family behavior during her illness provides clear justification for her decisions." The reality was settling in. Their behavior during my final months had permanently determined their financial future, and there was nothing they could do to change it. David attempted one final appeal. "Mom, if you were testing us, that's not fair. We didn't know we were being evaluated." "David, I wasn't testing your ability to perform under observation. I was documenting your natural behavior when you thought I couldn't hold you accountable for it. You failed a test you didn't know you were taking because the test was measuring who you really are." Susan, who had been quiet throughout most of this revelation, finally found her voice. "Mom, I don't want 40% if it means my siblings get so little. Can't we find a more equitable solution?" "Susan, your response right now is exactly why you're inheriting 40%. Even after learning how your siblings treated me during my illness, your first concern is their well-being rather than your financial gain." But the most important lesson was still to come. "I want all of you to understand that this experience has taught me something crucial about the relationship between love and money. For 6 months I watched you calculate the financial implications of my death while showing minimal genuine concern for my suffering or your loss. You taught me that money changes people in ways that make authentic relationships impossible." I pulled out one final document, a letter I had written to be read after my actual death, whenever that might occur. "This letter will be opened when I die, whether that's next year or in 20 years. It contains my final thoughts about each of you, based on how you treated me during what I believed were my final months. That letter will be your actual inheritance, not money, but the truth about who you became when you thought no one was watching." The letter would serve as a permanent record of their character during my dying months, preserved for future generations to understand exactly what kind of people they had been when they thought their mother was too sick to notice their greed. As my children left that evening, each clutching their copy of the new will, I realized that my 6-month experiment had accomplished something far more valuable than teaching them about inheritance. It had taught me about the difference between family and love, between obligation and affection, between what people say and what they actually value. The woman who had been given 6 months to live had used that time to discover who really deserved to benefit from her life's work, and the results would reshape my family's understanding of love, money, and moral accountability for generations to come. But the most satisfying part of the entire experience was knowing that my recovery meant I would be alive to watch them live with the consequences of who they had chosen to be when they thought no one was keeping score. 2 years after my miraculous recovery and the revelation of my experiment, I was sitting in my garden, reading updates from the Morrison Foundation for Elder Dignity and reflecting on how completely my family had been transformed by learning that their greed had been documented and measured. The foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations, helping hundreds of elderly people whose families had prioritized inheritance over integrity. But the most dramatic changes had occurred within my own family, as each of my children grappled with the permanent consequences of their documented behavior during my final months. Susan had used her inheritance to establish her own charitable foundation focused on family mediation and elder care advocacy. Instead of keeping the money I'd left her, she had transformed it into a platform for helping other families avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed ours. "Mom, I keep thinking about how differently I might have behaved if I'd known you were documenting everything," she told me during one of our weekly garden visits. "But that's exactly the point, isn't it? You needed to see who we really were when we thought no one was watching." Robert, Patricia, and David had each responded differently to learning that their inheritance had been calculated based on their documented greed. Robert had initially attempted legal challenges to the will, but the evidence of his behavior was too comprehensive to dispute. Eventually, he'd been forced to confront the reality that his reduced inheritance was a direct consequence of his choices during my illness. But what surprised me most was how the experience had changed their future behavior. Patricia had become genuinely introspective about her relationship with money and family. "Mom, I never realized how calculating I sounded when I talked about your assets." Hearing those recordings played back was like listening to a stranger who happened to have my voice. She had started volunteering with hospice organizations, learning to provide genuine emotional support to dying people without any financial motivation. "I want to understand what it means to care for someone who's dying without thinking about what I might gain from their death." David had perhaps changed the most dramatically. His reduced inheritance had forced him to reconsider his entire approach to financial planning and family relationships. "Mom, I spent my whole adult life assuming that my parents' money would eventually be mine. I never considered that I needed to earn that inheritance through my behavior and character." He had begun working with elder law attorneys, not to challenge wills, but to help families establish ethical frameworks for discussing inheritance and end-of-life care. "I want to help other families avoid the mistakes we made. I want to teach people that inheritance is a privilege that should be earned through love and respect, not assumed as an entitlement." But the most profound transformation had been in my own understanding of legacy and family relationships. The experiment had taught me that the most valuable thing I could leave my children wasn't money, it was a clear understanding of the relationship between character and consequence. By documenting their behavior and making their inheritance dependent on their documented character, I had forced them to confront who they really were and who they wanted to become. "The foundation has received its largest donation yet," James Peterson told me during one of our quarterly meetings. "An anonymous donor has contributed $5 million specifically for programs that help families navigate end-of-life conversations without compromising relationships." I smiled, knowing that the anonymous donor was probably one of my children, using whatever inheritance they had received to fund programs that would help other families avoid the mistakes that had cost them so dearly. But the most rewarding development was the change in how my grandchildren related to money and family. Susan's daughter Emma, now 16, had been profoundly affected by learning about her family's documented greed during my illness. "Grandma Betty, your experiment taught me that the way people behave when they think no one is watching reveals their true character. I never want to be the kind of person who treats family members like ATM machines." Emma had started volunteering with the foundation, helping develop programs that taught young people about ethical approaches to family wealth and inheritance. "I want kids my age to understand that money should never be more important than relationships, and that greed is the most expensive thing you can inherit from your family." The ripple effects of my 6-month experiment were spreading through generations, creating a family culture that prioritized character over cash and relationships over inheritance strategies. But perhaps the most important lesson had been learned by me. During those 6 months when I thought I was dying, I had discovered that the most valuable legacy I could leave wasn't financial, it was moral. By forcing my children to confront the documented evidence of their greed, I had given them an opportunity to choose who they wanted to be going forward. Some had risen to that challenge more successfully than others, but all of them had been forced to acknowledge that their behavior during my final months revealed something about their character that needed to be addressed. "Mrs. Morrison, your story has become something of a legend in estate planning circles." Margaret Chen, a family therapist who worked with the foundation, told me during a recent consultation. "We're seeing more elderly clients who want to document family behavior patterns before making inheritance decisions." The idea was spreading. Instead of assuming that biological relationships automatically entitled people to inheritance, families were beginning to understand that inheritance should reflect the quality of relationships and the character of beneficiaries. "The most powerful part of your approach," Margaret continued, "was that you didn't just punish bad behavior, you rewarded good behavior." Susan's larger inheritance wasn't arbitrary, it was based on documented evidence of her genuine care for your well-being rather than your wealth. As I sat in my garden that afternoon, watching the sunset and reading letters from families who had been helped by the foundation, I reflected on how my supposed final months had actually been the beginning of my most important work. The doctor had given me 6 months to live, but I had used those months to learn how to really live, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I owned. The experiment had cost my children most of their inheritance, but it had given them something more valuable, a clear understanding of the difference between love and greed. My miraculous recovery had given me years to watch them integrate that lesson into their lives, to see them become better people, because they had been forced to confront the worst aspects of their character. The foundation continued to grow, helping other elderly people whose families needed to learn the same lessons my children had learned. And every case reminded me that the most generous thing you can do for people you love is to hold them accountable for their behavior, especially when it's difficult and painful. I never did tell my children exactly when I learned about my recovery. They continued to believe that I had been dying throughout the entire 6-month observation period, which meant that their behavior during that time represented their authentic response to my terminal illness. That authenticity was what made the experiment so valuable. They hadn't been performing for someone they knew was evaluating them. They had simply been themselves when they thought their dying mother wasn't paying attention to their calculations and manipulations. The recordings and documentation from those 6 months remain sealed in a vault at James Peterson's office, available to be released if anyone ever challenged the Foundation's work or questioned my competence during the estate planning process. But more importantly, they served as a permanent record of what happens when families prioritize money over morality. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about how differently things might have turned out if my children had responded to my supposed illness with genuine care rather than inheritance anxiety. They might have inherited equal shares of a substantial estate and maintained loving relationships with their mother. Instead, their greed had cost them millions of dollars and taught them that character is the only inheritance that really matters. The most expensive lesson they ever learned was that love and money are not the same thing, and that treating a dying parent like an estate to be managed rather than a person to be cherished has consequences that last far longer than any terminal diagnosis. But the most valuable lesson was that it's never too late to change who you are, as long as you're willing to face the truth about who you've been. My children learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it, and my grandchildren learned it by watching their parents grapple with the consequences of documented greed. The Foundation would continue long after my actual death, teaching future generations that inheritance should be earned through character rather than assumed through genetics. And my family would remember forever that the 6 months when they thought I was dying were actually the months when they learned how to live with integrity. The doctor had told me I had 6 months to live. Instead, I had used those months to teach my family how to love without conditions, and how to leave a legacy that measured character rather than cash. Some experiments change everything. The best ones change everyone. And this experiment, this test of family character during a terminal illness that turned out to be temporary, had changed my family's understanding of love, money, and moral accountability in ways that would last for generations. The woman who was supposed to die had instead taught everyone around her how to live, and that, I realized, was the most valuable inheritance anyone could leave their family.